What would you do if 27 hours after saying "I do," you discovered your new spouse was keeping the kind of secret that could get you both killed? 13th June 2021. The mountain town of Oak Ridge, Montana, woke to news that shattered its peaceful facade. Sheriff Gabriel Martinez, the town's most trusted lawman, lay dead in the honeymoon suite of the historic Pine Valley Lodge. The weapon? His own service pistol. The shooter? His bride of just 27 hours, Ruby Alexander. While the town reeled in shock, Ruby sat calmly in her white bathrobe, tear tracks staining her cheeks, speaking 5 words that would haunt this community for years to come. He gave me no choice. But what could drive a woman to shoot her newlywed husband, a respected sheriff with a spotless record, just hours after their fairy tale wedding? What secret was so devastating it turned a dream marriage into a nightmare overnight? The truth would unravel a decade of lies, expose a web of corruption, and force this quiet mountain community to question everything they thought they knew about the man who had sworn to protect them. This is the story of the 48-Hour Bride. Ruby Alexander moved to Oak Ridge in September 2020, carrying little more than her camera and what she called a need for something real. A photographer who had made her name capturing small-town America for various regional magazines, Ruby found herself drawn to the rugged authenticity of this Montana community. She rented a small studio apartment above the local pharmacy and started taking portraits for local families, her talent for capturing genuine moments quickly earning her a reputation in town. Gabriel Martinez had been Oak Ridge's sheriff for 8 years by then. At 42, he cut an impressive figure in his pressed uniform, his badge gleaming as bright as his reputation. A decorated veteran who had returned home to serve his community, Gabriel was the kind of lawman who remembered everyone's name and never missed a town council meeting. After a divorce 3 years prior, he had thrown himself into his work, earning a reputation as the most dedicated sheriff the town had ever seen. Gabriel was the backbone of this community, the kind of man who'd shovel an elderly resident's driveway before starting his patrol. That's just who he was. Their first meeting came during Oak Ridge's annual Harvest Festival. Ruby had been hired to photograph the event, and Gabriel was there overseeing security. No one could have predicted that this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of corruption and end in tragedy. Their first meeting at the 2020 Harvest Festival sparked what the town would call a whirlwind romance. Ruby, documenting the small town celebration through her lens, caught the sheriff's attention when she captured an unexpected moment. Gabriel helping a lost child find her mother. The photograph would later appear on the front page of the Oak Ridge Gazette, the first of many times the pair's paths would cross. In the months that followed, Gabriel became a frequent visitor to Ruby's downtown studio. She was building a photography series on local first responders, or so the town believed. But between portrait sessions and casual coffee meetings at the Pine Valley Diner, something deeper was developing. By December 2020, they were inseparable. Gabriel's deputies noted how their serious sheriff began leaving work on time, even taking full lunch breaks, something unheard of in his 8 years of service. Ruby, meanwhile, was seen less at local events, focusing instead on what she described as a personal project, one that kept her late at the library, poring over old newspapers and town records. Their engagement in March 2021 surprised no one. The announcement came during a town council meeting where Gabriel had just finished his monthly security report. The ring was his grandmother's, a classic Montana sapphire that matched the blue of Ruby's eyes. The town celebrated. After all, their beloved sheriff deserved happiness, and Ruby had become one of their own. But as the couple planned their June wedding, subtle changes began to surface. Gabriel spent more time in his office, reviewing old case files. Ruby's personal project expanded to include lengthy phone calls that would abruptly end when someone entered her studio. Yet in a town as close as Oak Ridge, no one thought to question what lay beneath the surface of this perfect romance. The wedding was set for June 12, 2021, on the grounds of the historic Pine Valley Lodge. The mountains provided a stunning backdrop as clouds painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. Nature itself seemed to celebrate the union of Oak Ridge's most prominent couple. Ruby arrived at the ceremony in a vintage lace gown, her dark hair adorned with local wildflowers. Gabriel stood tall in his formal uniform, his badge polished to perfection. 200 guests watched as they exchanged vows beneath an arch of mountain lupines and columbines, their promises of forever echoing across the valley. But among the guests, one face stood out. A man, unrecognized by most, lingered at the edges of the celebration. When Ruby's eyes met his during the reception, Gabriel's hand tightened on her waist. "Just an old friend from Austin," he whispered, steering her toward the dance floor. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. The reception continued into the evening. Fairy lights twinkled in the pine trees as the couple swayed to their first dance. Guests raised champagne toasts to their future. Sheriff Martinez and his bride were the picture of happiness. By midnight, the newlyweds had retired to their honeymoon suite in the lodge. They were meant to leave for Yellowstone the next morning, a week of solitude in the wilderness. Instead, in less than 27 hours, one would be dead, and the other would be facing murder charges. In their honeymoon suite at the Pine Valley Lodge, Ruby Martinez sat at the antique writing desk, her wedding dress now exchanged for a silk robe. Gabriel had stepped into the bathroom to open a bottle of champagne, leaving his briefcase by the bed, the same briefcase he'd kept close throughout their courtship, the one he always brought home but never opened in front of her. Something about the mysterious man at the wedding had stirred a memory in Ruby. A photograph she'd seen while researching the town's history, a case file she wasn't meant to find. Her hands trembled as she reached for the briefcase. Inside, beneath stacks of routine paperwork, she found a folder marked Isabella Reyes, Confidential. The timestamp on the documents was from Gabriel's time as a detective in Austin, Texas. But it wasn't the file's existence that made Ruby's blood run cold. It was the photograph's paperclip to the back, and a bank statement showing a substantial transfer dated just days before Isabella Reyes vanished. The sound of running water in the bathroom masked Ruby's rapid breathing as she quickly photographed the documents with her phone. Each swipe of her finger revealed more damning evidence. Isabella Reyes hadn't simply disappeared, she'd been silenced. And Gabriel, the man Ruby had married just hours ago, had orchestrated it all. The water stopped. As Gabriel emerged from the bathroom, champagne glasses in hand, he found Ruby exactly where he'd left her, but something had shifted in the air of the honeymoon suite. Her phone lay face down on the antique desk. His briefcase, though closed, had moved ever so slightly. "I found her, Gabriel." Ruby's voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Isabella Reyes, the informant from your drug task force in Austin." The champagne glasses clinked as Gabriel set them down. His warm smile, the one that had charmed all of Oak Ridge, faded into something harder, colder. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the lodge's ancient heating system. "You went through my briefcase. It wasn't a question." Gabriel's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, still holstered at his hip, a habit he couldn't break even at his own wedding. "That man at our wedding," Ruby continued, her fingers wrapping around her phone, "he was Dale Rise, wasn't he? Isabella's brother. He's been looking for her for 6 years." The truth hung between them like a loaded gun. Isabella Reyes had been Gabriel's informant in one of Texas's largest drug operations. Her testimony would have brought down not just the cartel, but several high-ranking law enforcement officials. Instead, she vanished, along with crucial evidence and a significant sum of money from a seized asset account. "You don't understand what you're getting into." Gabriel's voice had dropped to a whisper. "Some things need to stay buried, Ruby, for everyone's safety." But Ruby had already hit send on her phone. The contents of Gabriel's briefcase were now backed up to her cloud storage. As she stood, the silk of her robe rustling in the tense silence, she saw her new husband's expression change. In that moment, she understood with terrifying clarity. She had just become another loose end that needed tying up. What Gabriel didn't know was that Ruby's personal project over the past months hadn't just been about photographing Oak Ridge. She had been quietly investigating a series of small-town law enforcement corruption cases across the country for a major news outlet. Isabella Reyes' disappearance had been one of the cases on her radar long before she met Gabriel. When she first arrived in Oak Ridge and recognized the new sheriff as the same detective from the Austin case files, Ruby had chosen to get closer to find the truth. The photography studio, the small-town portrait sessions, the whirlwind romance, it had all been part of her investigation, but something unexpected had happened along the way. She had genuinely fallen in love with Gabriel, almost abandoning her investigation entirely, until she saw Dale Ray's at her wedding. In a fraction of a second, the honeymoon suite at Pine Valley Lodge transformed from a scene of marital bliss to a deadly standoff. Gabriel's hand moved to his holster as Ruby backed toward the door. The same hands that had tenderly held hers during their first dance now reached for his service weapon with practiced efficiency. "Don't make me do this, Ruby." Gabriel's voice was eerily calm. "We could have had everything. A life together. A family. Why couldn't you just let the past stay in the past?" Ruby's heel hit the base of the antique dresser. Behind her, a mirror reflected the scene. The rumpled bed still strewn with rose petals, the untouched champagne glasses, and her new husband advancing slowly, methodically, like a predator cornering its prey. She had a son, Gabriel. Ruby's voice cracked. Isabella had a 10-year-old boy. He still asks about his mother. The mention of Isabella's son made Gabriel hesitate, just for a moment. In that split second, his eyes flickered with something. Regret, perhaps, or memory. That moment of distraction was all Ruby needed. The struggle was brief, but violent. A gunshot shattered the midnight silence of Pine Valley Lodge. Then another. As the echo of the second shot faded into the Montana night, Sheriff Gabriel Martinez lay motionless on the honeymoon suite floor, his own service weapon still warm in his bride's trembling hands. When the first deputies arrived, responding to reports of gunfire, they found Ruby sitting calmly in a white bathrobe, tear tracks staining her cheeks. The gun lay on the antique desk beside her phone, which was still uploading files to her cloud storage. At 1:47 a.m., June 13, 2021, the first emergency call came from room 2112 of Pine Valley Lodge. Deputy Mark Sullivan, working the night shift, recognized the address immediately. It was his sheriff's honeymoon suite. Within 4 minutes, 3 patrol cars had surrounded the historic building, their red and blue lights painting the lodge's rustic exterior in an eerily festive display. They found Ruby exactly where she had been since pulling the trigger, perched on the edge of the antique desk, her wedding night lingerie covered by a white hotel bathrobe. Gabriel's service weapon lay beside her, next to a phone that was still automatically uploading files to a secure server. "He gave me no choice," she told the responding officers, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "He wasn't going to let me leave this room alive." In the hours that followed, Oak Ridge's small police force found themselves in the unprecedented position of investigating their own sheriff's death. As crime scene technicians photographed the room, a more complex picture began to emerge. The scattered documents from Gabriel's briefcase, the digital trail on Ruby's phone, the string of encrypted emails between Gabriel and someone known only as Handler. But perhaps most damning was the USB drive found taped beneath the desk drawer in Ruby's studio apartment. It contained 6 months of surveillance photos, recorded conversations, and meticulously documented evidence, not of a loving courtship, but of a carefully orchestrated investigation into one of Texas's most perplexing cold cases. News of Sheriff Martinez's death ripped through Oak Ridge like a summer wildfire. The same townspeople who had thrown rice at the couple less than 24 hours earlier now gathered in shocked clusters outside the Pine Valley Lodge, watching as crime scene investigators moved in and out of the building. But it was the revelation of Ruby's true purpose in Oak Ridge that truly shattered the community. Their local photographer, the woman who had documented their family portraits, their children's graduations, their town events, was actually an investigative journalist working to expose police corruption. The betrayal felt deeply personal. Within days, battle lines were drawn. Outside the Oak Ridge County Jail, where Ruby awaited her bail hearing, 2 opposing groups formed. One side held signs demanding justice for Gabriel, seeing Ruby as a manipulative reporter who had seduced and murdered their sheriff. The other group, smaller but equally vocal, called for a deeper investigation into Gabriel's past. The discovery of the Isabella Reyes files threw gasoline on an already volatile situation. As state investigators dug deeper into Gabriel's history, more inconsistencies emerged. Bank records showed suspicious transfers, old case files revealed missing evidence. Former colleagues from Austin began coming forward with stories they had been too afraid to tell while Gabriel was alive. The state of Montana versus Ruby Martinez became the most notorious case in Oak Ridge's history. The courthouse, a stately brick building that usually handled minor disputes and traffic violations, now found itself at the center of national attention. News vans lined the quiet streets, and journalists who had once been Ruby's colleagues now scrambled to cover her trial. The prosecution painted a damning picture: a calculating journalist who had orchestrated an elaborate scheme, seducing a respected law enforcement officer to expose alleged corruption, ultimately killing him when her investigation didn't yield the smoking gun she needed. They pointed to her premeditated deception, the months of surveillance, the careful documentation, all signs, they argued, of a cold-blooded plan. But the defense had an unexpected advantage: Gabriel's own meticulously kept records. The briefcase that had sparked the fatal confrontation contained more than just the Isabella Reyes file. It held years of detailed logs, encrypted emails, and financial records that, when decrypted, revealed a complex web of corruption extending far beyond a single missing informant in Texas. What's more premeditated? Ruby's defense attorney asked the jury in her opening statement. A journalist investigating corruption, or a corrupt officer who spent 6 years systematically burying evidence of his crimes. As witnesses took the stand, a darker version of Sheriff Gabriel Martinez emerged. Former deputies from his Austin days testified about missing evidence, altered reports, and confidential informants who mysteriously vanished. Each testimony added another crack to Gabriel's carefully constructed image. But it was the digital evidence recovered from Ruby's cloud storage that delivered the most devastating blow. Audio recordings, captured during intimate moments in their whirlwind courtship, revealed Gabriel's growing suspicion that Ruby was investigating him. In one particularly chilling conversation just 2 weeks before the wedding, he could be heard making a phone call. "She's getting too close. We might need to handle this the same way we handled Isabella." The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution's star witness took the stand: Dale Reyes, the mysterious wedding guest, and Isabella's brother. For 6 years, he had been searching for his sister, following a trail that led him to Gabriel Martinez. His presence at the wedding hadn't been a coincidence. He had come to warn Ruby. "I saw the same pattern," Dale testified. "The charm, the whirlwind romance, the careful isolation. My sister trusted Gabriel too. She believed he would protect her when she agreed to testify. Instead, he made her disappear." The trial's most shocking revelation came when prosecutors introduced Isabella Reyes' final video testimony, found in Ruby's cloud storage. Recorded secretly during a meeting with Gabriel in 2015, it showed Isabella confronting him about missing evidence in the cartel case. "You're working for them, aren't you?" Her voice trembled in the footage. "Everything we did, all those raids, you were protecting them the whole time." The video continued, revealing a complex operation where seized drugs disappeared from evidence, cartel money was laundered through police accounts, and informants who discovered the truth met tragic ends. Isabella's final words on the recording sent chills through the courtroom. "If anything happens to me, Gabriel, this video will be your end." 3 days after recording that video, Isabella Reyes vanished. Her car was found at the Texas border, a single plane ticket to Mexico in the glove compartment. A clumsy attempt at staging her escape. But Ruby had uncovered bank records showing Gabriel had purchased that ticket himself. As prosecutors connected the dots between Isabella's disappearance and Gabriel's rise to power in Oak Ridge, a pattern of calculated deception emerged. The beloved small-town sheriff had built his new life on a foundation of betrayal, using his badge to hide from his past while systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him. After 3 days of deliberation on December 15, 2021, the jury reached their verdict. The courtroom was packed as Ruby Martinez stood to face her fate. The charges: second-degree murder of Sheriff Gabriel Martinez, not guilty by reason of self-defense. The verdict sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge. The same town that had once called for Ruby's head now grappled with the reality that their sheriff, their protector, their hero, had been at the center of a drug trafficking operation that spanned 2 states and claimed multiple lives. But the story didn't end with Ruby's acquittal. The evidence she had gathered sparked a federal investigation that reached far beyond Montana's borders. 3 months later, arrests were made across Texas and Montana. Former police officers, judges, and cartel members, all connected to Gabriel Martinez, found themselves in handcuffs. Isabella Reyes' body was finally discovered in April 2022, buried on a remote ranch outside Austin. The property, investigators learned, belonged to a shell company connected to Gabriel's handler, the same person who had been sending him encrypted emails for years. Today, the Pine Valley Lodge still stands, its honeymoon suite now infamous. Room 212 remains closed, but tourists still ask to see it. The room where a bride of 27 hours uncovered the truth about her husband, and a decade of corruption unraveled in a single night. Ruby Alexander never returned to Oak Ridge. The last anyone heard, she was working on a book about small-town corruption and the thin blue line between justice and power. As for Isabella's son, now a teenager, he finally has answers about his mother's fate, though they're far from the ones he hoped for. Some stories don't have happy endings, but sometimes the truth is worth more than happiness.